Welcome to the lesson on the soil water characteristic curve. My name is Dale Fredlund, and I am a professor emeritus at the University of Saskatchewan, Saskatoon, Canada. Much of our understanding of the soil water characteristic curve comes from earlier research in soil physics and agriculture. It is important, however, to review the use of the soil water characteristic curve as it pertains to geotechnical engineering applications. The soil water characteristic curve provides information on the amount of water in the soil and the energy state in the pore water. Geotechnical engineers must become familiar with laboratory measurement procedures for obtaining the soil water characteristic curve, and also the best procedures for best fitting and interpreting the laboratory measured data. The soil water characteristic curve information is primarily important for the determination of unsaturated soil property functions. Estimation procedures for unsaturated soil property functions have proven to be sufficient for most geotechnical engineering applications. I would like to start by asking a series of questions related to the soil water characteristic curve. 1. How should the amount of water in the soil be quantified? Should it be as gravimetric water content, volumetric water content, or degree of saturation? Number 2, are there different ways of quantifying the amount of water in the soil for different estimation procedures? Number 3, what is the effect of overall volume change on the interpretation of the laboratory measured soil water characteristic curve? Number 4, what influence does the initialization of the stress state at the start of the soil water characteristic curve test have on the interpretation of the test data? Number 5, what component or components of soil suction are plotted on the soil water characteristic curve? Number 6, how is hysteresis associated with the soil water characteristic curve taken into consideration for various geotechnical engineering applications? Number 7, what is the primary soil water characteristic curve information that is used when solving geotechnical engineering problems? I will attempt to answer these questions during this lecture. The soil water characteristic curve, or known also as the SWCC, is introduced as a single drying or desorption curve as soil suction is increased from a low value, which may be a fraction of 1 kilopascal, up to a maximum value of 1 million kilopascals. However, in reality, the soil water characteristic curve is a family of curves because of the hysteretic effects associated with suction reversals. If the soil does not undergo volume change while drying from near saturated conditions, the drying SWCC reveals two distinct transitions. The first break in curvature reveals the air entry value, and the second break reveals the start of residual conditions. The amount of water in the soil is generally measured as gravimetric water content in the laboratory test. However, the break in the soil water characteristic curve should more correctly be interpreted in terms of the degree of saturation, SWCC. The drying SWCC should be studied within the context of all volume mass relationships for the soil. If the soil undergoes volume change or void ratio change, as suction is increased, then it may not be possible to detect the true air entry value of the soil unless the soil water characteristic curve is plotted in terms of degree of saturation. Determination of the true air entry value of a soil is important since it depicts the suction at which a soil transitions from behaving as a saturated soil to behaving as an unsaturated soil. This slide illustrates the two volume mass constitutive surfaces that are required for a complete understanding of unsaturated soil volume changes and mass changes. However, it turns out to be the soil water characteristic curve defined in terms of degree of saturation that is most important for estimating most unsaturated soil property functions. A variety of laboratory apparatuses and test procedures have been developed for agricultural applications since the 1920s. Some of the past experiences in soil physics and soil science are of value for geotechnical engineering applications. At the same time, there may need to be some changes in the testing protocols for geotechnical engineering purposes. Following are some of the desirable features for geotechnical engineering. Number one, it is desirable to test individual soil specimens. Number two, it is desirable to test undisturbed samples. Number three, it may be desirable to apply a total stress to the soil specimen as the test proceeds. Number four, it may be desirable to measure volume change in addition to water volume changes. Number five, it may be desirable to measure the drying and wetting SWCCs. Number six, increased accuracy is required for most geotechnical engineering applications over that common to agriculture applications. The laboratory apparatuses must be easy to assemble and safe to use, noting that we are dealing with high air pressures. Number eight, it may be necessary to be able to monitor air diffusion when the test is being performed. Much can be learned from past experiences in the soil physics discipline. However, it is also important to evaluate which lab testing aspects are most important for geotechnical application. There are a number of apparatuses that have been developed within the geotechnical engineering profession in recent years. This slide shows an example of the pressure plate apparatuses developed at the University of Saskatchewan, Canada. The University of Saskatchewan cells make use of the axis translation technique. The maximum design suction has been increased to 500 kilopascals. This was done by increasing the robustness of the cell design and using a 5-bar ceramic disc in the base of the cell. Soil specimens are similar in size to those used for one-dimensional consolidation testing of saturated soils. 1 to 3 days are generally required for suction equalization under each applied pressure. A manufacturing company in Tempe, Arizona, GCTS, developed a pressure plate cell that extends the range of applied suctions up to 1,500 kilopascals. The apparatus has a number of special features that are of interest. Number one, a vertical total stress can be applied to simulate in situ stress conditions, or simply to ensure close contact between the soil specimen and the ceramic disc. Number two, vertical displacements can be measured under K0 loading conditions. Number three, the volume of diffused air can be independently measured during the test. It is also possible to use a relatively simple soil column to obtain the soil water characteristic curve relationship for coarse and medium grained sands. The test involves placing the sand in a dry condition into a column that is about 1 meter in height. The column of sand can then be placed in a pan of water. The distance above the water level in the pan controls the matrix suction in the sand once equilibrium conditions are attained. Achieving equilibrium conditions through upward wetting will reveal the wetting SWCC once water contents are measured at various distances above the pan water level. It is also possible to wet the soil from the top and in so doing obtain the drying SWCC for the soil. This slide shows a column of coarse-grained sand being tested from the bottom to obtain wetting from the bottom in order to get the wetting branch of the SWCC. A piece of tin foil should be placed over top of the column to prevent any surface evaporation. The column may take about 1 week for the water contents in the column to come to equilibrium. It is also possible to monitor the rise of the wetting front by the color change in the initially dry sand. The measured wetting and drying SWCCs are shown in this slide for 3 coarse-grained sands. The transition of the wetting and drying SWCCs indicates the sand's hysteretic effects. The soil water characteristic curve measured in this simple column test has been shown to be similar to test results obtained when using pressure plate apparatuses. The relationship between water content and total suction can be obtained through vapor pressure equalization of small soil samples placed in controlled relative humidity environments. The need for a series of controlled relative humidity chambers is no longer necessary because of the development of the chilled mirror potentiometer by Decagon. It is possible to prepare a series of small samples at slightly different water contents. Some specimens may be wetted by adding small but varying amounts of water, while other small samples may be allowed to dry by varying amounts. Once moisture equilibrium has been achieved, each soil specimen can be placed in the chill mirror device. Each measurement simply requires about 1 minute. Total suction measurements can be made over a range of a few hundred kilopascals up to more than 100,000 kilopascals. An understanding of the soil water characteristic curve is of significant importance to geotechnical engineering because essentially all unsaturated soil property functions can be estimated from the soil water characteristic curve. The direct measurement of unsaturated soil properties is a costly process, one that is unrealistic for routine geotechnical engineering practice. While procedures for the estimation of unsaturated soil property functions may not appear to be perfect, the estimation protocols have been repeatedly shown to be adequate for most geotechnical engineering applications. It should also be noted that various estimation procedures have also been proposed for the estimation of the drying SWCC. The most common estimation procedure uses the SWCC for the SWCC are based on the grain size distribution curves for the soil, and the protocols are referred to as pedo transfer functions. This slide shows the calculated soil water characteristic curve predicted when using the Murray-Fredlund year 2000 pedo transfer function. The prediction of the soil water characteristic curve is based on the grain size distribution for the sand. There is one additional variable that must be assumed when making the estimation of the soil water characteristic curve, and it is the packing factor for the soil. The packing factor has some effect on the predicted soil water characteristic curve. Predictions appear to be most reliable for uniform coarse-grained materials. Let us now consider the steps that need to be followed for the interpretation of the drying soil water characteristic curve. The final objective is to estimate the desired unsaturated soil property functions. There's an arbitrary division that has been placed on the soil water characteristic curve, and it occurs at a suction of 1500 kilopascals. Below this value, matrix suction data are plotted versus gravimetric water content. This data is obtained from a pressure plate apparatus. Total suction versus gravimetric water content data is plotted for total suctions greater than 1500 kilopascals. The two data sets constitute a thumbprint for the drying behavior of the soil. Next, the intent is to find an equation that can be used to best fit the two data sets over the entire suction range. Most soils show a typical S-shaped sigmoidal behavior on a semi-log plot. Also, it should be noted that some soils have a bimodal shape to them. There are numerous equations that have been proposed to best fit the drying SWCC. The Fredlund-Xing 1994 empirical sigmoidal equation, along with a correction variable for the high suction range, will be used to illustrate the best fit of data in this presentation. Three main fitting variables are required. One indicating the inflection point, which in this case has a value of 75.4 kilopascals, and another variable which indicates the rate of desaturation, which in this case has a value of 1.63, and a third variable is also used for fitting the data near the residual suction conditions. In this case, the residual suction is near to 1000 kilopascals. This slide shows the Fredlund-Xing equation with red circles around each of the fitting parameters. The correction factor, capital C, forces the Fredlund-Xing equation through the fixed point of 1 million kilopascals at 0 water content, and this applies for all soils. Most geotechnical engineers may not be familiar with the sigmoidal form of equation. However, it is noted that most other proposed SWCC equations are also sigmoidal in form. Many closed-form empirical equations have been proposed to best fit laboratory SWCC data. The empirical equation can be written in terms of gravimetric water content, but can also be written in terms of other water content designations, such as volumetric water content and degree of saturation. Some equations are referred to as one-parameter equations, while others are referred to as two-parameter equations, and some are three-parameter equations. There are two common difficulties associated with most of the proposed equations. The equations are generally asymptotic to a horizontal line in the low suction range, and most equations do not accurately represent conditions beyond residual suction. This limits the usefulness of some proposed SWCC equations. Let us undertake a brief parametric study of the variables used in the Fredlund-Xing equation. The open square symbols in this slide represent the shape of a typical SWCC data set for a soil with an air entry value slightly less than 1 kilopascal. The derivative, or the slope of the SWCC, yields a bell-shaped curve which represents the change in pore water storage with respect to soil suction. The top of the bell-shaped curve corresponds to the inflection point on the pore water distribution function. There are three fitting parameters used in the Fredlund-Xing equation, namely A with subscripts Fx, N, and M. Let us consider the effect of changing each of these parameters. The A fitting parameter designates the inflection point on the empirical Fredlund-Xing equation. Changing the A parameter from 1 to 1000 translates the mathematical function 3 orders of magnitude on a plot of normalized water content versus logarithm of suction. The other fitting parameters are fixed while the a-variable is changed. The units of the a-variable are in terms of stress, for example, kilopascals. The inflection point will be a fraction of an order of magnitude larger than the air entry value for the soil. The N fitting parameter designates the steepness of the rate at which water is removed from the soil as suction is increased. In this plot, the inflection point is maintained at 100, while the N variable is changed from 0.5 to 4.0. A low N value signifies a gradual removal of water as suction is increased, while a high N value signifies a rapid removal of water once the soil starts to desaturate. Sigmoidal type equations have become the most commonly used functional form to fit data related to the amount of water in the soil to soil suction. The desire is to have a mathematical function that can be used to best fit suction data ranging from a fraction of 1 kilopascal to 1 million kilopascals. As I mentioned, there are two common limitations associated with most sigmoidal SWCC equations. First, the sigmoidal type equations are asymptotic to a horizontal line in the low suction range. However, the actual data may indicate a sloping line in the low suction range. Secondly, a correction factor needs to be applied to the laboratory data in the high suction range, since the mathematical function must go to zero water content at 1 million kilopascals. There are also other indications that the soil water characteristic curve is not a single unique curve. While attention is more commonly focused on the drying SWCC, there's also a bounding wet or wetting branch. In addition, there are scanning curves between the two bounding curves. Hysteresis models are required for a more complete characterization of the family of SWCCs. It might seem preferable to model the soil behavior through use of a more elaborate hysteretic model. However, it may simply not be practical to do so at this time in geotechnical engineering practice. Geotechnical engineering testing procedures have generally adopted the protocols historically used in soil physics and agriculture applications, namely, that the laboratory data testing of a soil will commence by initially saturating the soil and placing it onto a pressure plate device. In other words, the stress state conditions that existed in the field prior to sampling are wiped out. The stress path followed in the laboratory test is shown by the red line in this slide. That is, it follows the wetting absorption curve to a state of zero matrix suction. The soil specimen placed in the pressure plate device is then subjected to a series of applied matrix suction values. The collected data is referred to as the main drying curve of the family of soil water characteristic curves. The main drying curve becomes a reference curve from which other members of the family of SWCCs are defined. The initial drying curve corresponds to the case where the soil specimen is initially forced to start at a degree of saturation of 100%. The initial drying curve is of little additional value over that of the main drying curve. If the soil sample is initially dried and then allowed to be wetted under controlled suction conditions, the defined SWCC is referred to as the main wetting curve. And as a result, hysteretic effects can be quantified when both the drying and wetting curves are measured. This slide shows the laboratory measured SWCC results on a sand soil tested by FAM in 2002. 3 specimens were tested and the results from each soil specimen are essentially the same. The volume change of the soil specimen was negligible, and therefore the gravimetric water content plot can be used to define the air entry value of the soil. The air entry value defined on the main drying curve shows an air entry value of about 2 kilopascals and a residual suction of about 13 kilopascals. The translation between the drying and wetting SWCCs is about 1/3 of a log cycle in this case. The soil water characteristic curves on 3 specimens of a silt soil were also measured by FAM in 2002. The data are presented on this slide. Once again, the results show consistent test results for all 3 specimens. The air entry value for the silt was about 10 kilopascals, and the residual suction was about 120 kilopascals. The hysteresis between the main drying curve and the wetting curve was about 1/3 of a log cycle. Each of the above-mentioned tests required about 2 months to perform, mainly because of the time required to obtain the wetting curve. The complete testing program for the drying and wetting SWCCs is time-consuming, and it might not be practical for most geotechnical engineering projects. The primary information required by the geotechnical engineer is the air entry value and the residual condition information. A large 1G sloping surface model with plastic sidewalls was instrumented with tensiometers for suction measurements and TDRs probes for volumetric water content. The test was performed at Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. The measured data shows the response of the instrumentation to changes in applied surface moisture flux. Measurements were made at 3 sections along the model. The measured results followed the drying SWCC when the soil was subjected to a drying process, followed by the wetting process when moisture was applied at the surface. The results verify that the independently measured drying and wetting hysteretic curves were followed quite closely during both processes. FAM in 2002 undertook a search of the laboratory measured test results where both the drying and wetting SWCC branches were measured. Although there's limited data, the drying and wetting loops of the family of SWCCs were found to generally be congruent or parallel on a semi-log plot. In other words, the drying and wetting curves were parallel, and the sand and silt showed quite consistent hysteretic loops. The average hysteresis loop for the sand was about 25% of a log cycle, and the average hysteresis loop for silt soils was less consistent, but it had a value of about 50. Increases in the plasticity of the soil gave rise to more scatter in terms of the magnitude of the hysteresis loop. If there is overall volume change as the soil suction is increased, then it is necessary to separate the effects of void ratio change from changes in the degree of saturation. When this separation is made, it is possible to improve the accuracy associated with the estimation of unsaturated soil property functions. The separation between volume change and degree of saturation change can be made through use of the shrinkage curve of the soil. Estimation procedures for the assessment of the unsaturated soil property functions have generally been found to be adequate for geotechnical engineering applications. The relationship between gravimetric water content and soil suction is generally measured for the drying curve on a pressure plate apparatus. A similar drying suction path can be followed by measuring the shrinkage curve for the soil. The shrinkage curve defines the relationship between void ratio and gravimetric water content. These two data sets allow for the calculation of all other volume mass soil properties versus soil suction for the drying curve. Soil specimens used for testing on the pressure plate apparatus are typically about 7 centimeters in diameter and about 3 centimeters in height. The soil specimen might be from an undisturbed sample, from a Shelby tube, or it might be from a compaction mold. The lab testing could also start with soil at an initial slurry condition. The smaller soil specimens can also be prepared for the shrinkage curve test. The specimen is commonly about 3 centimeters in diameter and about 1 centimeter in height. The SWCC specimen and the shrinkage curve specimen are initially allowed to absorb water until the matrix suction is 0. Let us focus mainly on how the shrinkage curve test can be performed and how the shrinkage curve can also be estimated. The shrinkage curve specimen is formed inside a metal ring with an open top and bottom. The specimen is then allowed to lose moisture through evaporation to the ambient atmosphere. The challenge is to measure the diameter and the height of the shrinkage curve specimen with sufficient accuracy at various elapsed times. This can generally be done with sufficient accuracy using a digital micrometer. About 2 measurements can be made each day, and after a few days, the specimen can be fully dried in the oven. The laboratory measurement can be plotted on a graph of void ratio versus gravimetric water content, forming a hyperbolic shaped curve. The drying process starts by drying along a constant degree of saturation line. The soil subsequently dries to a horizontal line with no further volume change of the soils as soil suction is increased and goes towards 1 million kilopascals. The shrinkage curve data can be best fit with a hyperbolic function that has 3 fitting parameters. The hyperbolic equation proposed here was proposed by Murray Fredlund in 2000, and it takes the form shown on this slide. The equation has 3 fitting parameters. The a variable corresponds to the minimum void ratio attained upon complete drying of the soil. The B variable is calculated from the specific gravity of the soil and the minimum void ratio, and so is not really independent. The C variable defines the shape of the curve as the soil goes to a completely dry condition. Let us undertake a brief parametric study of this shrinkage curve equation in order to become familiar with the role that each of the fitting variables play. This slide shows the effect of changing the A variable, or the minimum void ratio, upon complete drying. It is clear that the A variable is related to the shrinkage limit of the soil. The A variable is a function of the shrinkage limit and the plasticity of the soil as explained by Casagrande in 1932. The shrinkage limit test has almost been lost from the Atterberg limit suite of tests over the years. This is mainly because of its close relationship to the plastic limit of the soil. The shrinkage limit can be estimated by first calculating the plastic limit value on the A line of the plasticity chart. The shrinkage limit is then calculated based on the actual plasticity of the soil and on the corresponding value on the A line. The A variable is equal to the shrinkage limit multiplied by the specific gravity of the soil. Now the B variable can be calculated as shown on this slide. So the parameters all have physical meaning. This slide shows the effect of changing the C fitting variable. A sharp curvature occurs for sands with a typical value of about 15. High plasticity soils will have a curvature variable closer to about 3. While the curvature variable has some effect on the shrinkage curve, it is the minimum void ratio that has the largest influence on the shrinkage curve. It is now possible to combine the laboratory results from the SWCC drying curve and the shrinkage drying curve to get the relationship for other volume mass properties versus soil suction. These functions are referred to as: number 1, void ratio versus soil suction; number 2, degree of saturation versus soil suction; number 3, volumetric water content versus soil suction. Let us consider the analysis of the data set for a typical silty clay soil. Shown in this slide is the shrinkage curve laboratory data. The minimum void ratio is 0.5, and the curvature variable is 5.6. The shrinkage curve data relates the void ratio to gravimetric water content during the drying process. This slide shows the gravimetric water content versus soil suction data for the same silty clay soil. The data is fitted with the Fredlund-Xing equation. The inflection point variable A is 82.2 kilopascals, and the steepness variable is 1.7. It is now possible to combine these two data sets, that is the SWCC and the shrinkage curve data, for the calculation of other volume mass functions with respect to soil suction. The first unsaturated soil function to be plotted is the void ratio versus soil suction. This is done through substitution of the shrinkage curve equation into the gravimetric water content SWCC that was shown on the previous slide. It can now be observed that volume change starts to occur for this soil once the soil suction reaches a value of about 20 kilopascals, and most of the volume change ceases when the soil suction reaches about 300 kilopascals. The total volume change upon complete drying is calculated as 22.5%. The next unsaturated soil property function to be plotted is the degree of saturation versus soil suction. This is accomplished through consideration of the basic volume mass relationship, that is, SE is equal to W times specific gravity, G sub S. In other words, the water content function is divided by the shrinkage curve equation while marching forward through increases in suction to the maximum value of 1 million kilopascals. This curve shows some different features from those shown on the gravimetric water content versus soil suction plot. The calculated degree of saturation versus suction results can now be refit using the Fredlund-Xing equation as shown on the next slide. The degree of saturation versus soil suction plot generally shows a more distinct bend in the curve, and as a result defines more clearly the point at which the soil begins to desaturate. This is the true air entry value for the soil. The three fitting variables obtained from the fitting process will deviate from those that were obtained for the water content definition of the SWCC. For example, the inflection point on the water content function was 82.2 kilopascals, and now on the degree of saturation function, the inflection point has increased to 262 kilopascals. The effect of volume change is significant. The newly defined degree of saturation versus suction curve for the drying soil can be used for further analysis of unsaturated soil behavior. By drawing a line tangent through the inflection point of the degree of saturation function, along with a horizontal line from zero suction, the intersection point defines what is called the true air entry value of the soil. In this case, the air entry value is 147 kilopascals, a value much larger than was observed from the gravimetric water content versus suction function. There is value in being able to mathematically define the air entry value from the degree of saturation function. The calculation of the true air entry value can be reduced to a closed form mathematical equation, but is beyond the scope of this talk to show that. The degree of saturation SWCC can now be used to compute the permeability function for an unsaturated soil. The red dots were obtained by using the Fredlund-Xing 1994 integration procedure, starting at an air entry value of 149 kilopascals. Also shown on this plot is the permeability function calculated if the gravimetric water content function is used during the integration process. In other words, the use of the gravimetric water content SWCC gives the wrong permeability function. The recommendation is that the degree of saturation SWCC be used when estimating the unsaturated soil permeability function. There is one more volume mass function that can be calculated, namely that of the volumetric water content versus soil suction. In this case, the gravimetric water content SWCC equation and the shrinkage curve equation are combined as shown by the equation given on this slide. The volumetric water content SWCC provides a convenient form for defining the water storage function. Water storage is defined as the slope of the volumetric water content function. Therefore, the water storage function can be obtained by differentiation of the volumetric water content SWCC. The water storage function is highly nonlinear with relatively low values in both the low and the high suction ranges. The maximum water storage occurs near the inflection point of the volumetric water content function. Before closing this lecture on the use of the soil water characteristic curve in unsaturated soil mechanics, let me say a few words about dealing with hysteresis. That is the difference between the drying and the wetting processes. The emphasis thus far has been on the analysis of the drying SWCC. This slide shows the boundary curves associated with the drying and wetting process. In this case, the wetting bounding curve has been shifted to the left by 35% of one log cycle. Only one variable needs to be changed in moving from the drying curve to the wetting curve, namely the inflection point variable. In this case, the drying inflection point has been shifted from 262 kilopascals to 117 kilopascals. This corresponds to 35% of one log cycle. These two curves can be used to estimate the drying and wetting permeability function as shown on the next slide. The calculation and plotting of the two permeability functions provides the geotechnical engineer with additional information for making an informed judgment regarding the use of the permeability functions. Let me conclude this lecture with a series of suggested guidelines and recommendations for consideration with respect to the use of the soil water characteristic curve as part of the unsaturated soil mechanics in geotechnical engineering practice. Here are my suggestions. The drying SWCC can be estimated for preliminary design purposes. It can be estimated, but for final design purposes, it should be measured. Number two, it is important to use the SWCC equation that covers the entire range of soil suctions that are of interest for a particular engineering problem. Number three, the estimation of the unsaturated soil property functions should first be defined for the drying SWCC branch. And number four, the geotechnical engineer should determine whether the process being simulated corresponds to the drying or the wetting branches of the SWCC. Some further suggestions are as follows. Number five, let the volumetric water content versus soil suction be used when computing the water storage function for a soil. Number six, there are two key points along the degree of saturation SWCC that are of primary importance. These are the air entry value, AEV, and the residual suction and the residual water content. Number seven, the degree of saturation versus soil suction relationship must be used for the interpretation to get the true air entry value of the soil and the computation of the unsaturated hydraulic conductivity function. So what have we learned? First, we have learned that the drying water content SWCC and the shrinkage curve of the soil need to be measured when dealing with an unsaturated soil mechanics problem. Second, we have learned that we can separate the effects of volume change and desaturation of a soil through analysis of the SWCC and the shrinkage curve. Number 3, we have learned that we can use estimation procedures to obtain unsaturated soil property functions that are of sufficient accuracy for most geotechnical engineering applications. It is now up to geotechnical engineers to promote the value-added benefits that can be accrued from measuring the soil water characteristic curve and the shrinkage curve of soils and applying this information in engineering designs.